On the night of October 25th, 2015, in a dangerous part of Nova Iguacu known locally as K11, the body of a man was found lying on the sidewalk. Bloodstains and spent revolver shells lay nearby. In the stillness of the night, only the glare of passing headlights cut through the darkness to reveal the scene. Witnesses later told authorities that shortly after the shots were heard, they saw a woman walking along the road. She stopped but did not approach the body. She stood on the opposite side of the street, silently watching. There were no identification documents on the man, but keys and a cell phone were found. Investigators later identified him as 27-year-old Felipe Lavina. At that time, no one knew that his girlfriend, law student Helen Curry, had been nearby, and that her involvement would become the focus of one of the most widely followed inquiries in the history of Rio de Janeiro. Just hours before Felipe's body was found on a street in Nova Iguacu, events in the neighboring city of Mosquita were already unfolding that would later shock all of Brazil. It was about 4:15 a.m. on October 25th, 2015. The Lavina family home sat in a quiet neighborhood where reports of aggressive behavior were rare. On the third floor, Felipe and his girlfriend Ellen were asleep. The silence was suddenly broken by heavy footsteps and the sound of a door being forced open. 3 armed men climbed the stairs straight toward Felipe's bedroom. Their movements showed they knew exactly whom they were looking for and what they wanted. One of the intruders shouted, "Where's the 300,000?" The demand sounded as if they were convinced a large sum of cash was inside the house. Felipe explained that there was no such amount. He opened a metal safe built into the wall. Inside were only about 2,000 Brazilian reals, money intended to pay employees at his chain of gyms. The enraged intruders began shouting and accusing him of lying. One of them struck Felipe several times with the butt of a firearm. Ellen stood nearby, frightened, but later claimed she was not physically touched. Downstairs, Felipe's mother, Fatima Lavina, woke up from the commotion. Terrified, she heard the noise but did not intervene. She understood that any action might cost her son's life. One of the assailants stayed on the first floor to control the parents, while the other 2 kept watch over Felipe and Ellen. After several minutes, the intruders made a decision. They would take whatever they could: cash, cell phones, and personal belongings. They forced Felipe and Ellen out of the house and into a silver Fiat Punto that belonged to Felipe's brother. The car headed toward Nova Iguacu. On the way, Felipe was beaten. The investigation later documented marks on his body consistent with being struck with a firearm butt. In the K11 area, known for its high rate of criminal activity, the vehicle came to a stop. It all ended quickly. Felipe was pulled out of the car, and one of the assailants fired 2 shots into his head with a .38 caliber revolver. Ellen was left nearby and told not to look back. She ran to the nearest payphone and called her father, not emergency services. When family members arrived at the scene, she was standing across the street, staring at Felipe's body but never stepping closer. Investigators would later mark this moment as the first sign that something didn't add up. Her calm demeanor, her lack of reaction, and the fact that she made no attempt to help, all of it would become the starting point for a very different version of events. Before that tragic night on October 25th, 2015, Felipe Lavina's life was on a promising path. Born and raised in Mosquita, he came from a family that valued hard work and independence. By the age of 27, he had become the owner of 2 successful gyms in the Baixada Fluminense region, a rare achievement for someone from that area. Fitness was his passion. He trained hard, coached others, and inspired those around him. Clients often spoke of the supportive and disciplined atmosphere in his gyms. Felipe lived in his parents' house, occupying the third floor, which he had turned into his own private space, a place where he could work, relax, and spend time with his son. The boy was 9 at the time. Felipe adored him, took great care of him, and often brought him along to training sessions. His mother, Felipe Lavina, recalled that she only trusted a few people to help with her grandson. One of them was Helen Curry, Felipe's girlfriend. Ellen was a law student, 4 years younger than Felipe. She came across as quiet, polite, and responsible. Their relationship looked solid from the outside. They traveled together, went to events, and Helen even helped care for Felipe's son. But over time, Felipe's family started noticing things that raised concern. Felipe's sister, Daniele, said Helen showed an unusual interest in money. She often asked about the gym business and how much Felipe was making. Her behavior seemed to shift depending on the environment, calm and polite at home, but boastful when around friends. The family tried not to dwell on it, assuming personality differences were normal. Still, their trust in Ellen slowly began to fade. Felipe, according to those close to him, truly believed in the relationship. He introduced Ellen to the family, gave her access to his home, and didn't hide any of his finances. He even spoke at times about a future together. The metal safe in his room, known only to his inner circle, was used to store money meant for paying gym staff and suppliers. As far as anyone knew, only Felipe and his parents were aware of it. The relationship between Felipe and Ellen lasted about a year. On the surface, it seemed like a typical love story. But as investigators would later discover, small but troubling signs began to emerge during that time. Just weeks before the crime, Felipe's father noticed that the house keys had gone missing. They were never found. Around the same time, Ellen began insisting that the dog be locked up in the yard, saying she was afraid. To the family, these requests seemed harmless, until those two details would later align with a much more sinister event. Helen had a way of making just the right impression. To the neighbors, she was a kind, hard-working student. To Felipe's friends, she came off as a caring partner. But in the eyes of his family, she was described as distant, almost emotionless. No one could have imagined that within weeks, her name would dominate police reports, and that every word she spoke would become the center of a legal battle between investigators and her defense team. Felipe's life before the crime read like a self-made success story, a young entrepreneur who had built everything on his own. But it was exactly that, his stability, his financial standing, and the deep trust he placed in those closest to him, that laid the groundwork for what would ultimately become a tragic end. Once the initial shock of Felipe Lavina's death wore off, the investigation kicked into gear. From the start, the circumstances raised red flags. There were no signs of forced entry at the Lavina home. The front door, the gate, even the lock to Felipe's private room, all had been opened without any struggle or damage. For seasoned investigators, that was the first major clue. Whoever committed the crime had easy access. Inside, the house was undisturbed. The safe, where the missing money had been stored, hadn't been broken into or ripped from the wall. It had simply been opened, either with a key or by someone who knew the code. Nothing about the scene pointed to a random robbery. Even the family dog, normally protective and alert to the slightest noise, had been locked away. That detail was especially notable because it was Ellen who often asked for the dog to be confined, claiming she was afraid. And on the night of the crime, the dog was, in fact, locked up, giving the perpetrators clear access to the home. Police combed through the scene. There were few signs of a struggle, just a few drops of blood on the floor and numerous shoe prints. Investigators quickly determined that the suspects had fled in a vehicle belonging to Felipe's brother. A few days later, the car was found abandoned in the Posse area of Nova Iguaçu. The license plates had been removed, but the VIN number confirmed its identity. Inside, officers found bloodstains on the back seat and fingerprints that didn't match anyone from the family or the victim. Police began piecing together the timeline. Using security footage, they were able to track the general direction of the car's movement, from Mosquita to the K11 neighborhood, the same place where Felipe's body was found. The total distance was just about 5 miles. As investigators began connecting the dots, the idea of a robbery no longer held up. The missing house keys, gone weeks before the break-in, the lack of forced entry, the dog being locked away, and the precise knowledge of the safe's existence all pointed to one thing. Someone on the inside had provided critical information. The family recalled that only a few people knew about the safe and the money stored inside. One of them was Helen Curry. There were no official suspects at that point, but the focus of the investigation started to shift, from unknown intruders to those closest to Felipe. After Felipe Lavina's body was found, the first person to be questioned was Helen. Investigators expected signs of shock, tears, confusion, maybe fear. But instead, she remained calm, gave brief answers, and showed almost no emotion. She told the police the incident happened suddenly and that she didn't see who pulled the trigger. But several inconsistencies began to raise red flags. First, Helen never reached out for help. She didn't call emergency services, even though she had a phone with her. Second, she confidently pointed investigators in the direction the suspects had gone, despite saying she hadn't seen the road. Third, witnesses described her behavior at the scene as distant. She stayed across the street from Felipe's body, never getting close, which struck many as strange for someone who had just experienced such a traumatic event. Despite these contradictions, Helen was initially treated only as a witness. Authorities continued to pursue the theory of a robbery gone wrong. That changed when a man arrived at the station with his 17-year-old son. He told investigators that the teenager had been involved in the crime and was ready to confess. That teenager became the turning point in the case. During his statement, he described the entire sequence of events in detail. His testimony flipped the investigation on its head. According to him, the crime was planned in advance, and the person who initiated everything was Helen Curry. She allegedly provided the exact location of the safe, told them how much money was inside, and even handed over the house keys so they could get in without making noise. He claimed that Helen promised to pay each of them once the money was taken. The plan was to kidnap Felipe, apply pressure, and force him to open the safe. But according to the teen, things spiraled out of control when Felipe resisted, and one of the others fired a shot. When they reached the K11 neighborhood, they made the decision to finish him off and get rid of the body. The teen also said there were 4 people involved in total, including himself. Investigators cross-checked the confession. Everything lined up. His knowledge of the house layout, the exact location of the safe, the fact that the dog had been locked up, and the missing keys weeks prior. He also revealed that Helen had told them in advance what time Felipe's parents usually went to bed, and that the house had security cameras, which would need to be disabled. When investigators matched those details with the real-world evidence, the theory of an unfortunate robbery completely collapsed. The case was reclassified, from a robbery resulting in death to an intentional crime carried out by a group acting under prior coordination. The public reaction was immediate shock. What had seemed like a tragic crime tied to theft suddenly turned into a story of betrayal. The woman once seen as a victim was now at the center of suspicion. Media outlets, citing leaks from the investigation, began referring to her as the mastermind. Ellen denied all allegations, insisting that the teenager's confession was a lie. But investigators noted that her statements kept changing. At first, she said there were 3 attackers. Later, 4. She initially claimed she knew nothing about the safe, then later admitted she had seen Felipe open it. The inconsistencies piled up, and with every new interview, her position weakened. By that point, investigators already knew that adult men with ties to the criminal underworld of the Baixada Fluminense were involved. Still, it was the teenager's testimony that proved decisive. It was the first time authorities had clear grounds to believe the crime was not random. The investigation entered a new phase. Now, suspicion extended beyond the group of assailants to the person investigators believed had orchestrated the plan. For the first time, Helen Curry's name appeared in official records not as a witness, but as the alleged organizer of the crime. Following the teenager's confession, police identified the other participants, Luis Chirino, Marlon Paranhos, and another man whose identity was never confirmed. Chirino was arrested first. He admitted taking part in the abduction, but denied responsibility for the fatal outcome. His account echoed the teenager's: keys, the house layout, knowledge of the safe, and the promised payment. Paranhos was not located immediately. Weeks later, he was found dead in a favela, reportedly over a debt dispute. The second accomplice died under similar circumstances. Investigators did not rule out the possibility that these deaths were intentional, meant to silence potential witnesses. With 2 key figures gone, the investigation began to unravel. Chirino, the only remaining suspect, gave inconsistent statements and repeatedly changed his story. He claimed he acted on Ellen's instructions, but failed to provide solid proof. At that point, the case reached a dead end. 2 possible witnesses were dead, a third had vanished, and the teenager was under protection. In the end, it was his testimony that became the foundation of the prosecution's case. This chapter marked the point when the robbery narrative was officially ruled out and the case was reclassified as a premeditated crime. Any suggestion that it had been a random act was now off the table. With 2 of the suspects no longer alive, investigators turned their full attention to the remaining 2 figures, Luis Chirino and Helen Curry. After reviewing phone records and the teenager's testimony, authorities formally charged Helen. In early 2016, she was arrested. During questioning, Helen denied any involvement, maintaining she had nothing to do with the crime. The arrest made headlines across the country. Public opinion split. Some demanded justice, while others viewed Helen as a victim of a flawed investigation. A few months after her arrest, the court granted a request from her legal team and released her. The decision was based on what the judge called insufficient evidence to justify continued detention. Helen was ordered to remain in the city. For Felipe's family, those directly impacted by the crime, this came as a devastating blow. Relatives expressed outrage, saying, "The system failed us again." Not long after, prosecutors submitted new evidence. Recordings of phone calls suggesting Helen had been in contact with one of the suspects shortly before the incident. The court ruled that this violated the terms of her release and issued a second arrest warrant. During her second arrest, Helen appeared calm and reserved, something captured by news cameras. The footage quickly went viral. Some saw her composure as confidence in her innocence, while others interpreted it as a lack of remorse. By 2017, the court denied another request for her release, citing concerns that Helen might attempt to interfere with witnesses. By that time, the case had become a national sensation. On social media, people weren't just discussing the facts. They were questioning the entire justice system. Helen Curry's story was no longer just a legal case. It had become a symbol of how a courtroom drama can evolve into a public conflict, where opinions are formed long before a verdict is ever delivered. In July 2017, the trial of Felipe Lavina's death officially began at the First Criminal Court of Nova Iguazu. After years of investigation, Helen Curry's name was now known across the country, and public interest in the hearing was intense. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and family members, but with dozens of local residents who had followed the case from the very beginning. The atmosphere was tense. Helen sat at the defendant's table, expressionless, composed. Prosecutors laid out their charges, accusing her of orchestrating the crime out of personal gain. Their case was built on the teenager's testimony, along with key evidence: the lack of forced entry, her knowledge of the house layout, the missing keys, and phone calls recorded in the days leading up to the incident. Prosecutors argued that Helen wasn't just aware of the planned attack, she played a central role in orchestrating it. In the opening statement, the prosecution described the crime as an act of betrayal, carried out with cold calculation and a premeditated plan. The defense centered its strategy around challenging the credibility of the teenager's confession. Helen's attorney claimed his statements were made under pressure from law enforcement and were not backed by any solid evidence. He told the court, "This entire case hinges on the word of a teenager trying to lessen his own responsibility." The defense also pointed out there were no messages linking Helen to the perpetrators and argued that the alleged motive, greed, had no factual foundation. Over the course of the trial, the court heard from dozens of witnesses. Among them were Felipe's family members, staff from his gyms, neighbors, and forensic experts. The teenager, now the key witness in the case, testified behind closed doors. He repeated his claim that Helen had given the group both the keys and detailed information about the money. Although the judge noted inconsistencies in his testimony, the core of the prosecution's narrative remained intact. One particularly tense moment came when Luig Chirino failed to appear in court. He had been subpoenaed but was nowhere to be found, and his whereabouts were unknown. While this complicated the sequence of events, the court ruled that his absence didn't weaken the overall evidence presented. Helen also took the stand. She calmly denied any involvement. She repeatedly stated that she loved Felipe and was caught in a situation beyond her control. According to her, the crime was carried out by people she didn't know, and her name had been dragged in as a way for others to shift blame. "I lost someone I loved," she said, "and now I'm forced to prove I didn't cause it." The trial lasted several days. Prosecutors laid out a complete timeline of events, stressing that this was never a random robbery. The suspects knew far too much. The defense maintained until the very end that there was no direct evidence connecting Helen to the crime. On the final day of the trial, Judge Ana Cristina da Silveira Fernandez delivered the verdict in a packed courtroom. The court ruled that the prosecution had presented a compelling case and that Helen Curry's role extended far beyond passive involvement. She was found guilty of organizing the crime with aggravating factors, financial motive, and betrayal of the victim's trust. Helen was sentenced to 30 years in a high-security correctional facility. As the verdict was read, she remained still, emotionless. The reaction from the Lavina family was completely different. Felipe's mother and sister broke down in tears and embraced each other while his father told reporters, "Justice has finally been served." The judge emphasized that Helen, with a background in law, fully understood the consequences of her actions and knowingly used Felipe's trust for her own benefit. The court classified the crime as a meticulously planned act, and Helen's behavior following the incident as showing no signs of remorse. Her attorney immediately filed an appeal, claiming violations of due process and arguing that the teenager's testimony had been coerced. However, in 2018, the Court of Appeals in Rio de Janeiro upheld the conviction, ruling that the defense's arguments lacked merit. According to court documents, Helen was ordered to serve her sentence at Banguvors, a women's prison. Since then, there have been no updates indicating the case has been reopened. As for the others involved, The teenager whose confession formed the backbone of the case was placed under a juvenile correctional measure and released a few years later. Luigi Chirino disappeared after early questioning and remains a wanted fugitive. This marked the end of one of the most high-profile cases in the Baixada Fluminense region. The court ruled that Felipe Lavina's death was a crime committed from within his own circle of trust, one in which the victim had no reason to suspect that danger was coming from someone he cared about. Despite the formal conviction, the case continues to spark public debate. Years later, uncertainty still surrounds Helen Curry's name. Officially, she is serving a 30-year sentence at Bangu Bay. However, unconfirmed rumors of her release have circulated online. Judicial authorities have not commented on these claims. In the midst of renewed online interest, a movement emerged under the name Helen Curry Injustiçada Inocente, which translates to Helen Curry, wrongfully accused and innocent. Supporters argue that the evidence used against her was circumstantial and that the key testimony, given by a teenager, was obtained under pressure. They offer an alternate version of events, portraying Ellen as a victim of both circumstance and judicial error. Felipe's family sees these efforts as deeply disrespectful to his memory, insisting that the sentence was fair and backed by strong evidence. But the public has remained divided. This case exposed deeper issues: growing distrust in the justice system, the emotional divide between facts and feelings, and the conflict between legal judgment and public opinion. The story of Felipe Lavina revealed how easily love, betrayal, and personal gain can become entangled, and how even after a sentence is handed down, questions can linger for years.